Speaking of departments, and to bring us back to center, I wanted to introduce our new senior VP of migration, Todd's new title on the team.
I
So
wanted
Todd,
to be the executive VP of Funk, but they wouldn't let me. So
congratulations. Yeah, I asked for what? Supreme Allied Commander, and I got shot down on that one too. So.
Well, that's for obvious reasons.
HR, they hate fun.
Department of No. So
that's IT.
Part of the reason for Todd's battlefield promotion is today's topic.
Are we starting? Because
we've started.
Still a minute before. Okay.
Is it?
Well, that's fine. Yeah, it's only 12:29.
Yep. But we're at the top. We're at the topic. Today we want to talk about. We always are happy to talk about migration and different ways to move data around. But some of the business scenarios that lead to it that are pretty common that we've all worked in have been mergers and acquisitions, right? A company gets bought, spun off, folded in, et cetera. So we thought there were some unique things there, and we kind of put today's conversation together in that context. So 3 things, really. The business context, the background for it, the technical nuts and bolts from Todd, and some of the lessons that we've learned in practice. So Todd, do you want that I do the business context and then tee it for you on the technical piece?
You can. My subscription to the Journal of Accountancy is still active, so I could do the businessy part, but I don't want you to feel unwanted and unneeded. So,
okay. I mean, if I subscribe to the IEEE, does that make me an engineer?
No. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Just testing the limit to that. Got it. So a little bit of business context. We're using these working definitions. You can talk to 100 finance people and get about 150 different definitions. But for mergers and acquisitions, we're integrating a new organization, or we're being integrated, depending on whether on the sell side or the buy side, right? And the new co probably has some existing corporate functions. Bad news is there's going to be redundancies there. And a lot of times there's uncertainty in those shared service functions over who stays and goes. No one ends up, or rarely do they end up with 2 HR departments, 2 IT departments, 2 finance departments for any meaningful length of time. So there's definitely those impact the dynamics a lot. And then divestitures, a little bit different, right? There's not an existing corporate function all the time. If you're carving something out to have it stand on its own, wide open, green fields, blue oceans, et cetera, which comes with some challenges as well. The negatives, the processes aren't defined. You need to build it from the ground up. So those are the 2, right? The big thing we've seen, pay a lot of attention to that TSA, not the Transportation Safety Authority, right? But the Transition Services Agreement, very common with terms around how long. So like you can continue to use our Workday after we've spun you out for 90 days. After that, you got to have your own HRIS or your own Microsoft 365 tenant or your own instance of SAP or Oracle or whatever the systems are. A well-written TSA is going to govern all of those things and be pretty specific about it. So I think Mark or Todd, do you want to talk a little bit about the typical steps that we take under one of these scenarios?
I don't know, Todd, am I allowed?
Is it yours?
I will allow it. So I gave time to Mike, so I would be unfair to not.
So
go ahead.
Well, it sort of regardless of which direction you're going, you're splitting, you're joining, you're calving. Is that okay? Is HR going to get me on that one? We tend to do content inventory first. What's the lay of the land? What's out there? What are the types of content? What are the general sizes of content? Where are the heavy lifts going to be? Where is it going to be relatively simple to get something done? We also have to do a solution inventory, especially for a tenant where there's been a lot of custom development and there are things in the app catalog, either internally developed or maybe there are third-party solutions in there as well. And sometimes those solutions may be needed by the organization that's spinning out, or they may be needed by an organization that's coming in, and we have to figure out how to reconcile those things. We have to do an inventory of users. Who are the people who are involved in this different reorganization, and who maps to what domain, where are they coming from, where are they going to, how are we going to think about Active Directory, though that tends to be a little bit of a separate conversation than what we think about when we're thinking about the Microsoft 365 tenant, and maybe SharePoint. We have to look at the site inventory and think about, well, what are we going to do site by site or library by library, or depending on the level of granularity. This is also an excellent time to do a lot of cleaning house, because the metaphor we always use is don't pack all of your old crap in cardboard boxes, put them in the moving van, and then put them back in the basement in the new house. You just don't need to move them. So a lot of sort of cleaning up can happen there if we're migrating out to a new tenant. And
Mark,
then there's, yep.
Part of our prep for this, I think, too, was we're talking primarily about SharePoint, right? We're not talking about Teams, Exchange, et cetera, just to make sure we're scoped appropriately and we're listening to the right questions.
And part of the reason for that is some of those services are not mature enough to offer a lot of migration options. For instance, Teams, the APIs just aren't really there to migrate Teams well yet, though it's getting a lot better. And some of the tools can't really do it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say, though, that we can't do SharePoint until things like identity and exchange are in place. I can't remember if this is the slide that we talk about that or not, but congratulations, this is a slide where we talk about that. We're not going to migrate identity. That's going to be, probably somebody else's problem. We're not going to migrate exchange, but we don't want to start any of our stuff until those pieces are in place. And so it seems like a good idea to try to get some concurrency going on. But as we're going to talk about later, until your user situation is completely figured out, you're going to get a bunch of problems in SharePoint, and you're going to waste a bunch of time trying to fix things that won't need to be fixed once you get identity figured out. And I would not even look to getting SharePoint in any meaningful fashion, having anybody test anything until Exchange is figured out, till mailboxes are up there and people are using Exchange online. So yeah, we're not going to handle that here, but we have to be aware of it. We have to see it in the picture, and we have to make sure we fit in the right spot behind it.
Yeah. So actually, one of the steps is really figuring out all this sequencing, depending on what apps and services are part of the whole split, because sometimes you have to do things in certain orders or it doesn't work.
And we didn't cover it at all in this slide deck, and that's because I couldn't figure out where. But if we have things like flows that need to be moved around, those live in a completely different spot, but they're kind of part of SharePoint. So you'll have to find a way to figure out which flows, if there are flows necessary for some of that content, and move those over also. Export them out and import them and all that.
Do we want to cover the migrate archive step or move on?
So that was kind of Mark's don't pack the stuff, I think, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, but also, all of the previous bullets just lead to actually doing the work. I think a lot of people just jump into I'm going to start moving stuff without really doing the pre-planning steps. And you want to make sure that you have it all well mapped out before you even do the lifting.
Yeah, and Mark's analogy of, don't pack the boxes and take them to your new house is funny, because I moved into this house 5 years ago, and if I look in my closet, I can see 4 boxes that I boxed up from and have not unboxed. But the other thing is, my analogy for that, I feel the same way Mark does about SharePoint. I have a much less refined analogy. I always tell people, don't migrate crap. And that can be crap data that you don't need anymore. That can be crap solutions that you downloaded and installed to your app catalog and thought you were going to use and never did. Don't migrate crap.
All right, Todd, take it away, man.
All right, so we've talked about the identity piece, and I'm going to talk about it at least in one more slide because it's got some specific implications. But we have to have our users figured out, and this is for M&A or a divestiture, though it's a little different depending on how you're doing it. So let's talk about M&A first. So a merger or an acquisition. So company A bought company B. Depending on where in the timeline of all of this, the company B users probably are created in company A already, so that they can get to the portal and see the, welcome to whatever information, that kind of stuff. When we move the content over, whatever tool we use, and I mostly use ShareGate, so I'm going to talk about everything from the ShareGate experience, but all the other tools do the same kind of thing. Company B might have been small, so I might have been B, whereas company A is a big, giant behemoth, and there's a lot of Todds at company A. So I might be Todd.Clint at company A. And so we have to make sure that my new users are created and that we've got a mapping somewhere. As the SharePoint person, you may or may not have visibility to that. So somebody's going to have to get that for you, so that when SharePoint brings things across, it knows that, this amazing work of art that Todd at company B created is Todd.Clint at company A. So from the M&A perspective, that's important. From the divestiture perspective, the other way, so we've got company A, which has, we'll say 1,000 users, and company B is going to split off, going to be 100 users. We need to know who those 100 users are and pull them out and get them all set up in Azure AD. But either way, we're going to have to understand the user bit so that when, files come over, the created by, modified by, and all that gets pulled over.
Todd, I had a question on that about creating users, about getting two organizations, each with their own tenant, to be able to talk to each other and work across tenants. Do you have any recommendations or best practices there?
Sure, that it's the spasm like happened before.
So we need to mute whoever that was. There we go. Thank you. So the tenant to tenant stuff, I haven't done a lot with that. There's the obvious pits. We did an Ask Sympraxis a few months ago on sharing. So if it's onesie twosie stuff during the transition, that might be the way to do it. There is some business to business pieces inside of Azure that you can do that with. And I just haven't played with those much because normally whoever's, motivating this thing wants to get it done quickly. And those kind of band-aids tend to keep that process going because you don't have to face the pieces. But if anybody's got any specific issues, send them my way. I'll look into them.
Yeah, Todd, I think there was a war story there where a client that we worked at, a large client, had a particular consulting firm architect their Active Directory. And so the company that they acquired had done the same thing. So they each had a primary domain called Corp.
Yeah.
And it was impossible to establish trust between one domain and another domain by exactly the same name.
Yeah.
And it created a lot of problems for them over the course of the migration.
Yeah, so I can see wanting to go up to the cloud and ditch that would be a good solution. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Information architecture, there's a lot to do with that. I think Mark's probably better. He's better at making sure that gets done. He mentioned earlier that you got to do the work ahead of time before you do the technical stuff. I'll be honest, I get excited about the technical stuff sometimes. I might not put as much work into this stuff, but when you're doing the information architecture in either direction, if you're bringing things in, you want to know what the destination information architecture is and make sure that, if you want to make any of those changes to your stuff when it comes in, you do that. And if you're divesting, it's a chance to figure out, some things you wish you hadn't have done that you do differently, rename sites, maybe things like that. But it's just a good idea. It's a good point to make some of those changes. It's a good being forced to do things. Got a question in the chat room. Any way to add a test 365 tenant to an existing AAD, some users in test and production? I don't know of any way to have multiple Office 365 tenants use the same Azure AD because it really is the same group of users. So it's not like a product test user. Okay. Yeah. So you can invite a user. You can make a guest user. I try never to cross the streams on that. I never cross-pollinate test and production if I can get away with it. If you've got a specific scenario, reach out to me and we'll see. I don't know if I'll have time in this thing, but reach out. We'll see if we can figure that out. You can add them. You can add users from one tenant to another tenant inside of Azure, and that gets you some of what you're looking for. But if you've got a scenario, we can talk through it. The final common nut and bolt that I wanted to mention was you got to get your business users involved in this. And this is a refrain that I've been singing since the first time I ever migrated SharePoint from 2001 to 2003. I know SharePoint. That's arguable, I suppose, but I don't know how folks use SharePoint. I'm a terrible SharePoint user. And so one of the things that I always do, and I did a migration just like this. I did a divestiture last week or 2 weeks ago, I guess. Last week I was hanging out with all my Sympraxis buddies. But 2 weeks ago I did a divestiture, and I thought I had everything good to go. I went through the logs, everything looked good. and we had a business user test, and she's like, "Oh, this doesn't match this, and this is the thing," and I'd absolutely missed something. So you want to get them in as early as possible to test how your migration's going, because we're going to talk about how you test later, but you want to have them in early to catch those things, like the one that I didn't catch. And one other customer that we have is they've got this horrible migration. It's the devil, and we're not able to do it full fidelity, and that's the expectation. When we're talking about this, we're expecting to do it full fidelity, every single document and every single piece of data about every single document comes over. Because of some things that we can't control, that's not possible with this one migration we're doing. So having the business users involved and showing them the trade-offs helps make sure that we make the right decision for their business processes. The other thing is, when you get business users involved, you end up accidentally getting yourself some cheerleaders. And so when the migration actually comes over, if there are any problems, downtime, or things missing or whatever, you've got some people out in the field that you've built some rapport with, and hopefully, they can help you, let you know when the natives come at the castle with the pitchforks and the torches and all that.
I think there's a message in that. Get the business, I always hate calling it the business, the people in the organization involved in the whole process. Lots of times something like this is looked at as a technical problem. We're going to take this technical pile of stuff and we're going to move it over into this other technical pile of stuff. And that's where you end up packing a lot of stuff into boxes you don't need and things like that. This is an opportunity to do a transformation, right? You want to be able to have the people who are actually using the capabilities contribute to the conversation, so that not only are you moving the things that they need and want, but you're improving them if you can along the way. That's a big deal if you need to sell the whole process to your organization. If you can give them something better, then they're willing to help spend some time with you to make sure that things go right. So it's well worth it.
Yeah, and the other thing is, in IT, something that I lose sight of a lot is I'm not doing IT for IT's sake. I'm doing IT to help the business do their job better. So yeah, getting that feedback from them and not just moving stuff over because the technology's fun, but actually talking to the people whose job I'm trying to make better, see what they have to say. It's always good for me.
Crazy.
Okay, so divestitures. So this is the one where we've got a company and we're spinning something off, and some of the considerations for this one is we have to create a new tenant from scratch. So this is company A is really big, 1,000 people. Company B is being divested out into its own entity now. So now we're going to have to come up with company B's tenant. And some of the things that we've seen from that are we need namespaces, and so we need to know what to call, company B on Microsoft.com and company B.SharePoint.com, that kind of bit. Domain names, internet domains. You can't have the same internet domain connected to two tenants at the same time. So there's some tricks around mail flow and things like that. Again, this is another place, if you've got any kind of automation for site creation, things like that, they're going to be moved from company A's tenant to company B's tenant, any flows, Power Apps, any of those kind of things. And one of the things Mark's been mentioning a lot, resist the temptation to just take it all as is and just move it over, lift and shift. That is a very, very tempting option, especially when things start going badly, and it would be just so much easier to, but this is a good inflection point. One of the things that we did want to mention was we have had customers in the past, because there was no other option, do this basically tenant to tenant migration because they needed to rename their tenant. So they weren't merging or acquiring and they weren't divesting, but something in their company name was now not good, and so they just wanted to change that URL for their internal things. And so their only option at the time was to just completely migrate their tenant from, whatever, bad word to good word. But now we have this opportunity to rename the tenant. So now we can add a new tenant name and remove the traces of that old tenant. So that's relatively new. I think it's public, but it's still kind of I think you still got to ask Microsoft for permission. But if you ever have a customer who's thinking about doing this just to get rid of the name in their tenant, check out the renaming that.
That happens before we go to that happens a lot in spinoffs and stuff like that too, where the owning organization that's spinning something off may actually change its name in the process. So you don't need to be coming up with yet another tenant. You just do this renaming thing.
Yeah.
Could we touch on Julie's point here about what doesn't work around coding solutions and workflows that need to run in both the old co and the new co, and some of the things that we've seen trip people up or best practices around that?
Well, the comment I made on when we were doing prep was simply that depends on code. Sometimes this can depend on coding quality. Like when I write code and when I think the rest of our team writes code, we tend to like to make our code configurable, which means that, you know, there's a set of configuration files that sort of point to what's the tenant that I'm working on, or, you know, various configurations for that code to run, and nothing's hard coded in the code itself. And so if you are trying to make something run in two companies that used to run in one, and that code has hard coded values that identify that tenant, because that can often be a thing. If you're coding, you're like, well, I'm just writing this for our tenant, I'll just hard code the tenant ID or hard code the URL in the solution. And then when you're now trying to run that somewhere else, you're going to have to go and fix that code and recompile it to deploy it. So that can be, you know, what if you don't have the source code? What if you know, all sorts of issues. So knowing whether the code will run and testing it in a different tenant can be an important step.
Yeah, and hopefully you discovered all that when you did the review, you know, from 2 slides ago.
Yep.
Hopefully.
Yep. And I think, you know, on another point of that, Julie, is it's not just custom code. It's also things that you may have built using Power Automate, or things that Power Apps or Logic Apps that you might have built that have connections to existing infrastructure, existing sites, existing lists. All of those need to be checked to make sure that the contents that they're touching all migrate over as well, and the connections all get reset.
That actually made me think of something kind of interesting. One of the interesting aspects of Azure AD is that your app registrations for code need to be in the tenant where they're going to be used, unless it's a multi-tenant app registration. That's a different conversation. But I'm just saying, if you're using regular app registrations for your code, they need to be in the tenant, but the code actually can just live in one Azure AD instance, and they can be shared as long as they're configured correctly. So that could be that PSA type of thing that sort of says, yes, you know we have this custom code, these, you know, Azure functions, these SQL databases, whatever they are, live in our Azure instance. We'll just make sure you have another app registration so your employees can get to it. But for now, for the next 60, 90, whatever days, you can use our Azure instance before we have to duplicate that stuff. So that could be a later step. That's also something to think about.
Yep.
Do you guys have any luck migrating teams from tenant to tenant?
We have not been asked to do that yet, but I believe ShareGate supports that in as best the way it can be supported. So like Mark said earlier,
I actually had to try and do it once, and it was too early. And really, there wasn't. You could move everything in a team except its conversations. Well, that's sort of the thing that you want to move, right? So, if you're using a lot of third-party apps and things like that, lots of tabs and stuff in Teams, it's going to be a tough one. But the tools like ShareGate are getting better and better. They're getting better every time the API improves. So it all goes back to, are there APIs in the underlying service that allows you to do the things you need to do in order to do that migration?
Yeah. Yep.
All right, let's talk M&A.
Yeah. So this is merger and acquisition. This is the scenario where I have a great idea. I have a small little company, and then big company buys us and acquires us, and I get filthy rich. That is this scenario right here. So a lot of the same concerns, but just sort of twisted, like the bizarro concerns. So, like Julie's point about what does and doesn't work. Well, now it's the same problem, but now we're bringing our code from our old tenant into this new tenant, and it might be coded to the wrong thing. there might be security issues to worry about. The new tenant may have security that keeps service accounts from logging in, things like that. So we have to be aware of that. Also, don't just bring the data over if you can swing it, prune. Don't just lift and shift. Also, check out templates and that kind of stuff, and see if there's a new template you can be using. Create a new site if they've got templates for the sites you're bringing over. Don't bring, and I guess in ShareGate parlance, it's content and structure. If you don't have, if they've got a new template, you can just bring the content over and use the new structure if they've got something better. So it's the same sort of problems, but just twisted 45 degrees. Kind of backwards.
Todd, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that whether it's an M&A or a divestiture or any kind of migration piece, it's an inflection point, right? It's an inflection point for you to look at what's going on with the templates that you're using. What IA do you have, and are you using it? Look at the content and see whether or not it's being used and whether it meets the needs, because there's always going to be something that's working and something that's not. And so this gives you the opportunity to, I use the analogy clean out the junk drawer, but we all have our own little stories. But this gives you the opportunity to put new things in place, or create systems that didn't exist, or reinforce ones that did.
Yeah. So we just got a couple minutes left, so let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that I am not as diligent about as I should be is ShareGate, and again, I'm sure the other ones do it too. They have a pre-check option. So you set, so let's say we've done all the things on the source side. We've deleted data, we're not going to migrate, and I am just able to do a content and structure. So it's going to take a site in one tenant and move the entire site over, create it in the destination tenant, and set everything up. I've got that all defined, and I'm ready to go ahead and just give her a whirl and test it. ShareGate has a run a pre-check option, which just does what it sounds like. It, instead of actually doing all of the things, it looks to see what would happen if it tried to do the thing. And that runs considerably faster than moving the content for obvious reasons. But it shows a lot of things, like if you think you have all of your users created and everything mapped correctly, if you don't, this will show you before you spend 6 hours migrating content and then find out that a username was spelled wrong. If there's content types missing, or not terms that aren't in the term store, whatever, all of these little things that if you would have known ahead of time, you could have saved you a lot of troubleshooting. The pre-check is part of that. Running your inventory, it's like the belt and suspenders thing. Do your inventory, do all your due diligence, but then run your pre-check to see if anything snuck up. That saved me a bunch of times when I do it. So we talked about creating users. In any of your scenarios, you're probably gonna have to create users. What I wanted to talk about here was two things that I've learned is create the users even if they're gone. So it's obvious, when my company gets acquired, we're bringing Derek over. We're going to create Derek in the new company, obviously, right? He's probably the reason that we got acquired was for his talents. So it's obvious we're going to create a user for Derek. But what about Mike? We got rid of Mike a long time ago. Nobody liked Mike. So should we create Mike in the new company? Probably not. But the value of creating users in the new company, even if they don't exist or aren't active anymore, is there's going to be documents that we're going to bring over that Mike created, modified, things like that. And if we don't create a user for him in the new environment, we're going to lose that metadata. We're going to lose who touched that document. And so what I normally tell folks that I like to do is I run my pre-check. I find out all the users that are missing. I have the customer look at that and they're like, yeah, we got rid of those guys years ago. I create all of those users. Never log in as them. Don't license them. Just make sure they exist for the duration of the migration. And then once the migration's over, then we can delete those users. So that way, in the new company, Mike's name will show up and we'll know that he was the last guy to edit something. So that's one user bit that I talk about. Always create those. Number two, there's also some places in SharePoint where the automatic user mapping stuff doesn't work out well. So for created, modified, all that, it's really easy. But usernames can get wedged into weird spaces all over that the things like ShareGate aren't aware of, that it knows to do these automatic migration stuff. So things like if I create a custom field in a list and I have it do a people lookup, there's going to be usernames in there and ShareGate might not catch those. Or if a user owns a workflow, ShareGate might not catch those. So check your pre-checks and create all those users. Lookup column values have been a thorn in my side with one of my customers. They did a good thing. They had a list, and to make sure their data was, was clean and sanitized, they made a bunch of columns, lookup columns, so people couldn't mistype things. Great idea. But they did this years ago, and then as terms, products or whatever were not valid anymore, they removed those values from the drop down, which is great, good, clean, all that. But now when I move that list over, when ShareGate creates the list, it creates all the possible values. Now I start bringing list items over, and they reference values that aren't current anymore. And so now ShareGate can't match those up. So couple of things. Every time that comes up, Mark goes into a discussion about how they should have been using metadata, the term store, and retire those terms and all that kind of stuff, and they absolutely should have. But again, one of the things that PreCheck's going to tell you is what those terms are, so you can go create them. Again, I use PowerShell to do it because I use PowerShell for everything. But what that does is that gives me a way to undo it when I'm done. So if I'm like add term blah, then when everything's done, I can just remove, change all those adds to remove and pull those values back out. But that's something that comes up all the time. The last one, I know we're hitting on time. Use a test site, and then if you want to, so I always do like Sympraxis test or something. I use incrementals to practice doing the incremental so we can have downtime be short. If you have any documents that are registered as records, that breaks incrementals because you can't overwrite them. So I've got some PowerShell that I use when I figure out that's the case, that unrecords those. So then when I do the incremental, it can copy the records over. And then with one customer, we did all that, and it was a pretty big chunk of data, and it was going to be 6 hours to copy it over. And the customer asked me, he's like, well, if everything's synced up, why don't we just take that Sympraxis test account and rename it to the actual, or that Sympraxis test site? Why don't we just rename that to the actual name of the site that we want it to be? I'm like, that's a great idea. I'm glad I thought of it. And so that's what we did. So we just waited till Friday night at 5. I changed Sympraxis test to, new company, whatever, and it was done. And then last, one thing to keep in mind is if one of them is modern and one of them is classic, you need to make a decision on where that's going to go. So just another one to keep in mind. I went a minute over. Sorry, folks.
We also have we also have a couple of resources that we curated for you like usual. Some of the tools we have talked about in here that we've used in the past with some success across these. Anything to call out here specifically, Todd?
We all love ShareGate, so that's the one that we like for your inventories and things like that. And honestly, just for a good time and something you should have. Syskit's got a couple of tools. Syskit Point will show you permissions and security bits, so that's a good one for finding out, having a high level view of what's shared externally and all that. Those are all kinds of things you're gonna have to worry about. And then Syskit Trace gives you your tenant configuration bits. There's a bunch of great stuff there. And then we would be remiss if we didn't talk about Orchestry and how they help you create, templates and manage growth and all that. That's something to keep in mind as you're moving from organization to organization if those pieces are in place. But
all right, so next time, 2 weeks from today, we're really interested in hearing from the community about this. A lot of press, a lot of ink has been spilled about the hybrid workplace, remote work, and the stresses and strains it's putting on people. And we've all developed little techniques to preserve our time, our attention, and our sanity. And we'd like to talk about those in 2 weeks. Well, most of us have, with varying degrees of success. So that's our topic for 2 weeks from today. Thank you, Todd, our Senior VP of Data Migration and Automation. It's different every time. It's different every time we tell it.
My pleasure, Mike.
And thanks everybody for joining today. We'll plan to talk in 2 weeks. Feel free to keep the conversation going in the chat or via Twitter, but I know we're out of time.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.